Hey, what's going on everybody? Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be going through every step how we take a raw 3D printed helmet and make it nice and smooth and ready for paint. Now this might be a lot of work and somewhat time consuming, but in the end it is so worth it, so let's get started. So only if we could start out with a print this smooth, but unfortunately we can't. So the question is, how do we get here? The first thing you have to do is sanding. A lot of sanding. I usually start out with a rougher grit sandpaper and I work my way up. Something like 60 or 80 grit. The 60 or 80 does a really good job of really roughing up the print, and then you smooth it all out as you get into higher grits. And this is why it takes so much time. You do the whole helmet in one grit, then you do the whole helmet in another grit, and another, and another, and another. Alright, so now let's really get into the process. Like I said, we're going to start with that high grit sandpaper to really help even out those layer lines. Be sure to hit every spot of the print, because if you miss anything, it's going to sand out like a sore thumb. Oh, also, this step is going to create a lot of fine PLA dust, I guess. So be sure to be wearing some type of protection. I prefer to apply moderate force and quickly sand in a circular motion. I find that it really helps knock down the lines more than just going up and down or side to side. And two big tips here. First, this is by far the most tedious round of sanding, so if you have an electric hand sander, pull it out and go to town. Use the same circular motion, but the electric sander can really quickly burn through the PLA plastic, so don't spend too much time in one area. Just move around and make sure you hit everything. And secondly, you're still going to have to sand some hard to reach spots, so find something you can wrap the sandpaper around. It's just more comfortable and it'll help save your hand. In this particular instance, I am using a dish sponge, but they do actually make sanding blocks, sanding sponges that you can use to sand, or you can wrap the sandpaper around it. So now we're going to go up to 120. This is still going to be a little bit rough, but not as rough as the 60 grit. We're going to go over the entire helmet again, making sure to get all of our cracks and crevices. The 60 grit leaves all these little scratches all over the print, and starting with the 120, you'll kind of see those fade and disappear as you sand them away. Another good tip is if you're printing with white filament, it's a lot harder to see what you've already sanded than, say, gray or black filament. But the filament does have a little bit of a sheen to it, so you can kind of play around with it and move it around, and you'll see light coming off the filament. And if you see some shiny parts of your print, that means you need to sand a little bit more. When you're happy with the 120, we can move up to 220 and then 400. And as we keep moving up, the finer and finer and smoother the print will become. Alright, now we're going to move to filling. This admittedly may be a little bit overkill, but for a great product at the end, I don't mind it. We're going to be using Bondo glazing and spot putty, and we're going to be doing this in a few steps. First, we're going to be applying the Bondo at the top of the helmet. We did a ton of sanding up here, but the way the printer builds up layers, we're going to need a little bit of help to kind of fill all those big gaps in. This is also a great time to get yourself a little pick or something that can scrape out the Bondo from areas you don't want it. The back of the tube says this stuff is good to sand in 20 or 30 minutes, but personally I like to give it about 2 hours, because there's nothing worse than sanding Bondo that's not 100% dry yet. But once it's dry, I hit it with a little bit of 220, and like you see, make sure you're wearing your PPE. Now that we have one coat over the top of the helmet, we're going to go over the entire helmet now, following the same routine that we just did. And after that's done, I like to go over the helmet with just a little bit of soap and water because the Bondo creates such a light dust that it's almost impossible to get it all off. So it just helps keeps everything a little bit more clean. Now it's finally time to lay some primer down. Anytime I use primer or even paint, I like to read the back of the can and just follow whatever directions are listed there. For this particular brand, you just want to stand about 8 to 10 inches back and spray in nice, consistent, sweeping motions to avoid any runs. I usually like to do 2 light coats, waiting a couple minutes in between each, and then one last heavier wet coat to finish. Alright, now that the primer's dry, check this thing out. It looks great. All the layer lines are gone. There is some grit to it, but we still have even more sanding to go, so that's going to easily take care of that. We're just going to quickly pass over the entire helmet with 180 grit, and then back over it with 400 just to really smooth it out again. Honestly, if this was anything other than a Mandalorian helmet, I'd probably feel pretty good and let this go and start applying the paint, but being that it's a Mandalorian helmet, we're going to do one more light coat of primer, and then we're going to wet sand this thing to a glassy, smooth finish. So now we're going to do 2 more coats of the filler primer. The first one's going to be a little bit heavier than the initial ones that we did on the first pass. I would say a medium coat, but not quite a wet coat. And then we'll allow 15 minutes for that coat to dry, and then we will give it a heavier wet coat, and then this will be our final coat of primer. So the last thing we're going to do is, yes, believe it or not, more sanding, but this time we're going to do what is called a wet sand. You can wet your sandpaper, or you can wet your print, or you can wet them both. And we're going to be using a very fine piece of sandpaper here. I'm starting at 600, and we're going to go over the entire helmet once again in the circular motion, but not applying as much pressure as we did before. And then once that is complete, we're going to do it all over again, but this time with 1500, and this is what's going to really get us that nice, smooth, glass-like finish. Alright, now that this Mando helmet is done, let's go through all the steps that we had to do to get this smooth finish. So the first thing we did was sanding, started at a 60 grit, working all the way up to 400. Followed by the first round of Bondo along the top of the helmet where we knew that the layer lines were just too deep and we really wouldn't be able to sand them away. After the Bondo dried, we sanded it with 220 and then went over the entire helmet with Bondo, following the same steps. Once that was dry and sanded, we did our first round of filler primer, starting with a couple light coats followed by a heavy coat. We allowed that to dry for 24 hours and then we used 180 grit sandpaper, which went a long way to eliminating any of the layer lines that we had left. After that, we did more filler primer, this time with one medium coat and one heavy coat. And then 24 hours after that, we sanded again, but this time a wet sand with 400 grit and 1500 grit, which really just got rid of all the sanding lines and really is what gave this helmet this smooth of a finish. But with all that done, it is finally time to paint the helmet. So if you guys want to see that, make sure you're subscribed because that video is coming next. And hopefully that's when I see you guys again. So like I said, thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. And see you next time. Bye.